I was interacting with CJ on his short. He put out a short called "If You're Not Open Theist, ... Calvinism." Right, and now I want you to listen to this, and then I want you to check out the conversation I had with CJ in the chat. And I'm just curious as to if I have made a mistake here, or if CJ has made a mistake, or maybe there was something I missed or something that was faulty about his initial premise. But anyway, so I'll play the short, and then I will read the comment interaction I had with CJ. I want to know your thoughts, and because it's good to get an extra pair of eyes, right? Because if I've made a mistake in my premises or anything like that, then someone can show me. But yeah, we'll play this real quick.
Often object to the Calvinist claim of compatibilism by saying that compatibilistic free will cannot truly be free will. They'll basically say something along the lines of, I can't not do A if God determined for me to do A, and I absolutely will do A if God determined for me to do A. Therefore, my choice is not truly free. There's been plenty of answers to this, and I, of course, will be making more on my own channel. However, this question actually cuts both ways, because God knows infallibly that you'll do A, which means God knows infallibly you won't do B.
Sorry.
Now, you have options. You can say God.
What's that?
I mean, he's already starting with a false premise. He's talking about compatibilistic free will versus, what's he going to say, libertarian free will? Because compatibilistic free will is just the same thing as describing libertarian free will with the addition of this unspoken other thing that basically says something else other than that kind of just isn't spoken of until you're actually dealing with that concept, in which case you just jump to the other side and just say that it's still compatibilism because it involves both things. Like, I don't think there's an actual distinction being, but he might be going on bad. So
CJ's argument is whether you're a compatibilist or a not compatibilist. If you're not an open theist, his argument is ultimately we come to the same conclusion, because he's saying that if God, so there's a person, they can make choice A or choice B. They make choice A. God knew they would make choice A, therefore they won't make choice B. So he's saying whether you're a compatibilist or not, we're agreeing that choice A is the only choice that would be made.
That's just because he says that there's virtually no difference between God knowing and allowing something to happen,
right,
and actually being the direct cause of it to happen.
Right, and I think that's where you get it into the details there, right? So I said, well, God knew that they would choose choice A because he has ultimate knowledge. It is also possible the person could have chosen choice B if they wanted to, but God knew that they wouldn't. So determinism does not have to be the answer here.
So hold on.
And then
response is would be something. If it's possible, they chose choice.
Yeah, he says, so if it's possible they choose choice B, it's possible that God's knowledge is not infallible. And then I responded, how so? The person has the ability to choose either option, either A or B. And God ultimately knowing which option they will choose does not take away from God's knowledge. Right? So do you have any problem so far with the way I laid that out? Would you say that differently? Can you see that?
Yeah, go back to what you're responding to.
CJ says it's possible they chose choice B. It's possible that God's knowledge is not infallible. So what CJ is saying, if it's a possibility that they didn't choose A, that means God doesn't have all knowledge.
Because he can say that, and then he's like, well, we don't say that his knowledge is locking you into it. Like it's basically because again the entirety of this book is gonna come down to we don't know person is, what a soul is that can make a choice or not, and how that exists. They say that they do know. It's God literally thing, and because again, this is why this seems to be a modalistic sort of view of God, saying that in order for him to have this, because I agree, up there you said he has perfect knowledge or something, or I forgot what term you used.
Yes.
But
yes,
because his perfect knowledge includes foreknowledge, so because he is ultimately transcendent above all things, that includes all time, space, existence, matter, and everything else that you're going to choose and could choose. And this is where they also have trouble understanding. It seems that God can know all possibilities, and he also knows what possibility you are going to choose. And you say, well, how is that possible? Well, because he's God. I don't like, how is he God? Like the really question you're asking is why is God? How is God God? How does he have possible? Because again, and then they try to view this modalistic view. Well, how does he know unless he is somehow traveling through time, and learning things? Because this is what he's going to try to say. Well, is God's learning? He needs to be learning what you're going to choose in order to right? Because if God created all things, and he's saying if God's creation is based on what God has learned that you're going to choose based on the creation that you're about to create, he's going to create people in, then that's God. That's like, that there's your synergism, and that's God, being conquered by your counterfactuals or something.
right. Because I don't believe God learns anything. Like nothing catches him off guard. Nothing ever occurred to him. He's all knowing.
But remember that misconception is based on the fact that on the misconception that God is inside of linear time, because that's all creation is.
Well, here's the thing, though, Kelvy. In a sense, he is, but he's also outside of it.
Well, he's both. So, well, yes.
Yes.
So if it's a modalistic view, then okay, God created that. They admit that he created everything, but now if he needs to know anything, he's got to go into it. He doesn't need to go into it in order to know it, because this is where the nature of who Jesus Christ is and the Trinity, and the second person of the Trinity being intrinsically, basically having authority over all creation, because all creation comes from Christ, and then the Father, basically God has perfect knowledge over all creation at all times. It's not only because even though he, like you said, even though he is in creation, seeing things, traveling through it with us and through us, he's still the Father in heaven, and he's still the Word of God in heaven. Or when I say in heaven, I mean in eternity. And so he doesn't need to learn anything. He never needs to learn anything. So as long as any argument that you give us is going to be that God needs to learn anything, then it's going to be fallacious, because he never needs to learn anything. And so if you're going to say that something in an argument's invalid, then you're going to have to prove why we think that God needs to learn anything. Because based on God's very knowledge, or his very nature, he never needs to learn anything at all. Like that, so that's the problem. Because as long as they say, well, what about this? Because if this is the case, he would need to learn something. No, he would never need to learn something. So that entire premise is invalid.
Okay.
If it involves to learn something.
All right. So then CJ responds to my comment, and I'll reiterate my comment. I said, how so? The person has the ability to choose either option A or B. God ultimately knowing which option that they would choose does not take away from God's knowledge. And then CJ responds with, they do in a sense. But if he knows with 100% certainty that they will choose A, that is another way of saying it is 100% A is certain. And if A is 100% certain, then B cannot happen. If B can happen, in the and then he puts in quotations, future is open sense, then it's possible for God's knowledge to be wrong.
So this misconstrues how and why God knows all things. He doesn't know, because this right here is presuming that God knows that B is going to happen because God has somehow learned that it's going to happen based on learning something about what you were going to choose. That's not how we view things. We view things that God has knowledge, period. And he always knew it. He always knew it was going to happen. He always knew you weren't going to choose it. He always knew you were going to have a choice. You know, like, that's just a fact. Like,
see, but here's the thing, Kelvy. I don't think CJ is accusing us of thinking God has to learn. I think his argument is that if A is 100% going to happen because God knew it would happen, then he's saying in reality that means B actually wasn't possible. Choice B wasn't possible. And then he's saying, well, if I'm saying that B actually was possible, then it would have to be that God's knowledge is open. In other words, open theism. Now, because I believe that we actually have free will, I believe that we actually had a real ability, a real option to choose choice B, but we chose choice A, and God knew that we would choose choice A. So in CJ's mind, he's saying, well, that's not really a difference, because even though you had the possibility to choose choice B, you never would have. You choose choice A. And in his mind, he doesn't see a difference between determinism and God allowing it. Like he's saying, basically, it's the same.
Fitting God's perception to inside of time and linear time and space. It's structures. God doesn't even. He never would even need to learn anything about what you were ever going to do. Like, that's where this kind of thing is sort of like the idea of, and there's no there's because so we have to acknowledge there was never any possible world like where you were going to choose something else. Now, there was and there is different potentials, and that potentials are not the same as possibilities, although they usually are. But potentials are just they exist, but they're not substantive, and they're not actualized. What's actualized is what actually is that's what's happening. And so God always knew what was going to get actualized. So what this question of the future is open is like that God, so they can acknowledge perhaps that, okay, God may know all of these potentials. This is where you start getting into Molinism, but that God couldn't know what actualization was actually going to happen within the potentiality of things. But again, this all relies on the fact that the perception must be within the totality of existence, of time and space. But again, if he's outside of it, then none of that really matters. But that's the problem. If you're still going to look at it as if God has always got to be within side of his own creation and locked into that, because he can still.
But the question is, Kelvy, what do you think? Would be actually like
know everything, all the possibilities and what's going to happen from the beginning to the end? You can still always know, have still created it, said, "Yep, that's what's going to happen," and yet you're still making the choices, and yet he created it. He created you. And he's like, he knew you were going to go from point A to point B and not from point A to point C, and he always knew it. Now you want to ask me, could I have done otherwise? And it's like, you could have, but you didn't. And well, just because God knew that you were, like, there's no causal link there. Is there? This is where there's not really, you're trying to flip it backwards.
But Kelvy, he's going to, so then what CJ would say is then he would say you're a compatibilist. Because he would, that's where this conversation goes, where he's essentially saying, well, that's compatibilism.
Yeah, but our view doesn't have the contradiction. It doesn't require any kind of like the fact that God can create things like what I'm describing is not contradictory. That God is transcendent of everything that He's created. That He's looking down, so to speak, at all times, and or He always has in His He has perfect knowledge and awareness of all things within the creation and all possibilities. So here's the thing: all possibilities is not the same thing as all actualities. Do you understand the difference? Like, actualities is what actually comes to pass within the physical realm. There's
Right.
the metaphysical realm, and then there's the actual physical actuality realm. God always knew what actually, and then, we're locked into certain actualities, such as the planet Earth is spinning around and doing what it's doing, and then our thoughts are their own sort of actualities as well. And so then we have to say, like, okay, and then this is now at this point, though, we're already describing which is substantial within created time and space. God's already outside of that. The Father is still in eternity, and He still sees it all, because all things that have ever been created, the substance of all time and space that we're describing here, actuality and potential, has all come from Jesus Christ through Him. So he's laid it all out already. It's true.
Right.
But He's laid out.
So would the difference be, Kelvy, is that
actuals, and the actuals are included are included in that. Now, how He creates us, I don't know. So that's where they say, well, that it's the same thing. It's not the same thing. It's simply not. It's kind of like almost like brute forcing it. Like, well, if you don't know, then we have to say that it's completely that there is a direct causal link to, because again, like, so because I suppose it could be construed of what I'm describing. So let's compare what I'm talking about to the storybook that they always use.
okay?
Because I'm describing an actuality within time, because this is why it also doesn't work. I mean, because they would have to describe how like consecutive or like a spectrum of time actually exists versus the turning of pages and there being, but I don't know. But so what I'm describing is God creating, or there being creation, and the difference between potentials and actuals. So we have a beginning of time and an ending of time, and everything that happens in between that. God is always going to be outside of that, and He's also going to be inside of it. But He will always be outside of it, right? Because God is transcendent of it, but He's also interacting with it because of the Trinity. So what's happening within creation, again, He has full access to at all times. And creation, it includes the metaphysical. There's no part of creation that's eternal like God is. Yeah, that's what creation is. It's created out of as far as I'm concerned, it's created out of nothing. Like, there's no part of God that's created out of nothing. But so since He has full authority, because since He is sovereign, then there's nothing that's good. There's no part of, like, so, because this is where I would want to ask them, like, if they think that God can't know all actualities, or they think He can't know all potentialities, if based on what He's saying here, right? Because if I flip it around on them, it's like, okay, well, if that wasn't the case, if He didn't know all, if that, like, I don't know, I have to go to the bathroom.
See, because I don't believe that God creates our thoughts. I believe God creates the mechanisms which we process our thoughts, right? Like, obviously God has given us our souls. He has also given us a physical brain that the soul processes the thoughts and everything else through. But I don't think it logically follows that therefore God also creates the thoughts that go through those processes or mechanisms. So I told CJ what I'm trying to argue is that B was actually a real possibility, that the person actually had an option to choose, but they could have a choice that they could have chosen, but they didn't. And God knew that they would not choose B, but not because he determined that they wouldn't choose it, but because he foreknew that they wouldn't. And then CJ says, in other words, the agent couldn't have chosen B in so much as they have the capacity to choose B, but they could not have chosen B in so much as A is certain. And then he said, yes. And I think I agree with that. So I said, yeah, I agree. So A is certain, not because God determined A to be certain, but because God knew that they would choose A. And then, so he responds, as do I. But think about what you just affirmed. You are saying an agent can be free to choose either option in one sense, and the only one option is possible in another sense. So when someone says you can do other than what God determined for you to do, and the Calvinist says in a way yes, but in another way no, you are actually affirming the same thing. Instead of determined, you are saying no, God knows. Can you do other than what God knows you'll do? In a sense, yes, and in a sense, no. So basically what CJ is telling me is that I'm agreeing with compatibilism.
And the question is, do you believe that God knows everything that you never did and would never do?
Of course.
Why? Right.
Because he knows all things.
No, Kevin, do you understand that? That's a lot for God to know.
Absolutely.
Everything that you never did and never would do and could do. But so if he can know all that, then how could he also know everything that you would do and will do? It's almost as if he has complete perfect. Like I don't know. Maybe I'm just not smart enough to kind of see like where this, because again, if God is truly outside of these things, then where in the causality? In other words, the argument against compatibilism, namely this argument you can't do anything other than what God has determined, because I can only look at it from my own sort of lens, which is God always looking at it from the transcendent. So he always knows what you could do. He always knows what you would do. He can even guide us. I don't deny that. That's what the Holy Spirit does. Like, none of this precludes. And this is where the compatibilist argument usually just gets completely sidetracked versus the notion of what we're really talking about is who can believe the gospel or not. Versus, because again, like a lot of times, like the sidetrack as far as God having some kind of like conflict with causality and free will. Usually, again, people are fine with that. The real thing is, are people free to believe that Jesus Christ is the Word and be transformed? You know what I mean? Because again, this is where he's saying that there's not a big difference. Because yes, we affirm that God knows all things and that we have a free choice. So they affirm that as well, right? Because they say, well, then we're both compatibilists.
Right.
So, but they say that leaves a lot out of the equation, doesn't it? Because again, this is only minimize the causal link between knowing and allowing, and then what that this is, yeah, that's so because with one, there is a contradiction. With both of them, there's a mystery, but with one of them, there's a contradiction. Contradiction being, God is the author of evil, right? Because the only way
Yes.
working analogy, when they use the storybook analogy of Tolkien writing characters, and again, this is why it's so ironic they use Tolkien, because Tolkien actually described people having a sub-creative ability, and he's written stories about actual, you know, characters and settings, even in stories taking on a life of their own in a way, as a metaphor for sort of the interaction between creation and the creator. So everything that they're using to back up their view is actually the opposite of what Tolkien taught about this sort of thing. But if when they say, well, it's just like God, you know, just like Tolkien writing evil Sauron or evil Gollum murdering, you know, or being evil, like that doesn't, you know, he's just writing that into it. Like the only way that would work would be if those characters in that book suddenly started writing themselves. And here's the thing, God can certainly write into them things, but the thing is, what it means for something to have a life of their own versus something, because again, they're essentially saying that there's no separation in like quality between somebody created in the image of God, you know, and an animal or a tree. I don't see how it comes down to pantheism ultimately, honestly. Say, well, it's just because we're not, just because that God wrote it. Like that's the same difference, because that's the essence of the difference of what we're talking about, of what it means to be a rational, substantive thing, right?
Can you explain that, Kelvy? So how do you say it eventually breaks down to pantheism? Can you flesh that out? What do you mean by that? Like, because I know what pantheism is, but how are you coming to that conclusion there?
So if every single thing that's going on here, if you can't separate, if you can't separate a causal, if you have to imply a causal link, and you can't separate the choices that somebody makes from the knowledge of God in the way that it's being described here, like basically making the causal link being because, like, that you are choosing it because God knows that you're going to choose it, like is basically circular. So it locks all things that are in motion in creation, because we have to acknowledge that God is transcendent of all creation. So because he's transcendent of all creation, all things that he's seeing, he knows what's going to happen. And so based on what they're saying, if all choices happen because be the cause, you know, is of that, he knows that they're going to happen, and he does know all things are going to happen, so he is the cause of all things. Therefore, your choices, like, they can't get around perfect, exhaustive, you know, determinism and exhaustive causality. So that literally means that he is the literal controlling of all things. Because if they don't make any distinction between a mind and a body, you know, if they don't make any distinction between a thought and an action, if they don't make any distinction between a will, you know, and just a reaction, because in this sense they basically have creation reacting to the direct will of God, right? So now, of course, so to be fair, the accusation of pantheism. So here we go. So here's where I'm just going to shoot myself down here, Kevin. Because reaction to pantheism is the distinction between the creator and the creature, but I don't see the difference between a creature and anything else that's created in this case, and I think it could be argued that essentially, if all of these things are in the direct will of God, then they might as well be, as far as functionally, or at least like economically, maybe, like completely within the same like realm of what God's doing. Again, like there's no difference. We have no difference between there's no difference between us and the rest of the cosmos. And if we and the cosmos are all of the exact same substance and of the exact same ebb and flow of existence and creation, which is the direct will of God, we might as well be just simply direct extensions of the mind of God. Just like atheists and philosophers say all the time. We're just God experiencing himself in creation. Right? Doesn't like wouldn't that be basically what it is? Because what else would it be? We're just kind of pretending that you and I are talking here, but really it's God having an interaction with himself in some way.
Well, I believe in free agency. Like I believe you're your own agent and I'm my own agent. I don't think my thoughts are determined or implanted by God. I believe my thoughts are my own, just as I believe your thoughts are your own. Because I look at it this way: if my thoughts were God's thoughts that He has given me, then I think all of our thoughts would be the same. There would be no disagreement and there would be no uniqueness among other human beings. We would all just, essentially be extensions of God's mind in that sense. So there would be perfect unity in all things. And we don't see that demonstrated in nature. So I don't think it is logical to conclude that God is the one that's giving us all of our thoughts, because then we would have all the same thoughts.
Well, maybe who are you, oh man, to try to...
Well, that would be taking that verse out of Romans 9 out of context. That the hypothetical Jewish interlocutor that was in a hardened state because of he was part of the generation that crucified the king, and Paul was saying that God had a right to do that to accomplish the purpose of redemption. And the hypothetical Jewish interlocutor is saying, well, then how can God find fault with me? He has made me this way. And that's where he says, who are you, oh man? But then Paul goes on into Romans 11 saying that very generation can still be grafted in. So it wasn't a permanent hardness. They could still be saved. So the guy's objection was absolutely irrelevant.
Right. Well, I didn't mean to totally sidetrack. What was the
Yeah.
comments?
All right. So I respond to CJ, right? I said, but again, God knowing the outcome does not mean that it is determined. When I hear the word determined, I think of something as being forced to happen, right? So now, Kelvy, am I wrong in using determined in that way? Like if I say something is determined, doesn't that imply some form of force to make sure something happens just such a way?
Well, the problem is because I think they would say, well, no, you do have a choice, but the choice is just being given to you. It's like they would kind of be saying it's a different category, because they say what you think is a choice, is really doesn't truly exist, right? So you can still think it's a choice all you want. It's not truly a choice, because God already knows that you're not going to make that other choice. So why would God even bother to, put anything behind door number 2 or 3? Is my view of it. If that's the case, then then He doesn't actually do that. There's only something behind the door that God knows you're going to pick, which to me is a problem. This is where I don't think they see where because if you're talking about, if they think that open theism has to be the case, then again that means that God is also down here with us, looking at door number 1, 2, and 3, and that God is actually directly causing, which fine, what's behind door number 1, 2, or 3, as opposed to him being, again, completely and utterly and eternally transcendent of all doors and all numbers, and everything that would ever be behind anything at any given point in time. I'm leading up to that point. Because, again, to try to say that it's open theism, that God, well, I don't know. I think I'm rambling again.
It's all right.
It's down to being careful versus knowing something, determining something, have two different meanings. Yeah, I mean, because I know, like CJ likes to be like, we don't say that. We don't ever say that God knows it means that He's determining it. And it's like, yeah, well, you're basically saying that the causal link is the same. Because again, he seems to say, well, it's virtually the same thing. Like, according to our view, God allows it. He knows it. He created everything, knowing that what was going to happen in creation was going to happen, and He didn't stop it from happening. And therefore, he's responsible for it, and He's basically causing it.
Right.
And that's basically not, but He's not. Because that's what I say. Like, well, it's not the same thing, though. So what's the difference? That difference is the basis of the entire argument. So to minimize that difference and to say, well, we're basically the same. We're basically just, because, again, the reason that compatibilism even exists is because one of them says there's a contradiction. In our view, we say that it's a contradiction to say that God is causing evil directly, right? Because if you try to say, well, it must be like an open theistic view, this means that God is within all of creation. He's permeating all of creation. And he can't see over that hill because He's causing the hill to be created based on like everything that's just kind of happening at that time, because the only thing that actually exists is all of the present moment. But again, that's why I think it's modalistic, because even though God is within the present moment of all time, through the Son of God and His Holy Spirit, the Father is also always completely outside of all of it and sees the end from the beginning and sees all of the creation that He created, and He sees all of the free will beings or whatever you want to call free, the beings within that He's created that can make choices. He knows what choices they're going to make. He's put it, and the thing is, you've probably heard the theory about like the best possible worlds, the best of all possible worlds, which I agree with that. But to look at somebody, it's about if you think it's the best of all possible worlds, then that's to say that must mean that God chose between a whole bunch of other less than possible worlds, and they accuse that of being like what Molinism is. I don't agree with that characterization, because that implies that God had to. That implies that God needs to learn, like we do, about what kind of possible worlds that He even needed to make. Now, if you say, well, how is it possible that He didn't need to learn, that He just knew what possible world to make, based on all the different, because the problem thing is we don't even understand is that He, within creation, He created the possibilities themselves are built into the creation itself. And so even if we're choosing between something that will, and there's something else that nobody will ever choose, it's still there. It was still always there to be chosen. They're the one, they think it's more like a video game rendering, right? Where nothing's actually there until somebody's there to see it. As opposed to God's there to see everything that He's created in the totality of creation, all possibilities, all things that never happened, would happen, could have happened, didn't happen, and are happening. He is over it all. They think that the only thing that's actually in existence is the present time-space continuum. And that includes God being in that time-space continuum, limited to it. And based on that limited, tiny, lens, that claustrophobic, trapped in a tiny, snow globe view, then I can see where it's like, well, God must be really, intrinsically causing all this stuff to happen, as opposed to, again, him being transcendent, and then knowing the end from the beginning, and yet, creating us to do what we're going to do. I just don't see that.
Yeah, I don't either. So essentially what you're saying is that they're assuming God is somehow limited by time. Right?
Yeah.
Right. Now,
Time.
it's funny you brought up the what's his name? Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Here's Chris Date using that very
and as a big believer in the analogy, yeah, I absolutely agree that in the story, in the analogy, God enters into the story as a character, as the judge, and punishes people for doing what they did in the story, which he determined them to do. I understand that.
So God determines their sin and then judges them for it. And he used the author analogy that, in this instance, God would be the author of the Lord of the Rings novel, and he's writing Sauron and Saruman to do these terrible things, and then he's determined that that's what they're going to do, and then he judges them for it. I have a hard time seeing how that is just or holy.
Well, that's right. Well, he's writing what justness is. He's writing that Sauron then gets his comeuppance. So because he goes through these actions and motions of this basically caricature of justice, therefore that's fine, because God is always just. When you go with this extreme kind of view of what looks like in a divine command theory, right, where it's like God doesn't need to be expressing anything that we could recognize as love or justice, because what he says is justice is justice. So if God wants to break your head off 12 different times and keep you alive while he's doing it, and sit there and explode it and and cause the death of all your pets and your family for no reason, and laugh about it while you live in eternity forever for no apparent reason, that's justice because he says it is. Essentially, that's what it's all about, right? I don't believe that's the case. Now, of course, that's an extreme, ridiculous caricature. I understand that. But I think that what we do understand as justice and love, because we're made in the image of God, and because we're given Scripture, and because we're given revelation, and because we're given the Holy Spirit, we can trust and believe that, again, that God does desire all to be saved, right? And that because what you just displayed him saying, yeah, that's, you can't get there unless you take to the extreme. Because again, there's a difference between saying, well, he is allowing it, God's allowing that thing to happen, he's allowing Sauron to do the thing. That is a big difference than directly causing him to do it. So beware of when you see people trying to make that sort of equivocation. Just like, it's not really a big difference. Basically, it's the same thing. It's not basically the same thing.